It was one of the big demands of yellow vests protesters in this country. Tax the new giants of e-commerce that are killing small businesses. But on the day that France's parliament has voted a so-called Gafa tax of 3% on revenue earned on French soil for those big tech companies that hang their fiscal hat abroad, well, the Trump administration has paved the way for retaliatory tariffs. Legitimate gripe or another case of Washington weaponizing trade? Be fair, it's not just Donald Trump. The consensus in the U.S. goes beyond party lines to defend the interests of Silicon Valley there. The Silicon Valley, which, well, to a large degree, you might say, owns the internet. What's fair taxation in the era of globalization? The OECD and G20 nations are working on it, and France has said it will scrap the new tax once new rules are in place globally. But then again, will there ever be a consensus? Just look at Europe. While the likes of the UK, Spain, and Austria are also preparing Gafa taxes, smaller EU members who act as quasi-corporate tax havens like Ireland are resisting any threats to their model. How to break this crucial deadlock? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at France taking on the Silicon Valley. And with us, Florian Berco, he's the co-founder of Estimeo, a startups rating agency. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
I also want to welcome at this point Julien Belfigue, who is attorney partner at Deloitte Tage.
Yes, my name is actually Pelfigue, and I'm an economist.
Pelfigue, okay.
But that's okay.
Okay, my mistake. Quentin Parinello is a senior policy officer on tax justice at the charity Oxfam. Welcome to the show. And joining us from the Normandy city of Caen, Anne-Laure Delatte of the International Economics Research Group, CEPI. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A show of hands is all it took in the French Senate to ratify that digital tax bill. Lawmakers shrugging off those threats from across the Atlantic. Selena Sykes has more.
A digital dust-up. France's tax on tech giants is now under investigation by the US Trade Representative, who said the measure unfairly targets American companies. Comments rejected by French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire.
I profoundly believe that between allies we can and should resolve our differences through means other than threats. France is a sovereign country which makes sovereign decisions about its tax regime, and it will continue to make sovereign decisions about its tax regime.
The US probe, known as a Section 301 investigation, is the same method President Trump has used in his trade war with China, leading to fears of new tariffs or trade restrictions on French goods. The US has said, however, it would be open to the idea of a worldwide solution for taxing digital firms.
The United States will continue its efforts with other countries at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to reach a multilateral agreement to address the challenges to the international tax system posed by an increasingly digitalized global economy.
The French plan is nicknamed the Gafa tax after US tech giants Google, Amazon, Facebook and Apple. Such companies routinely funnel their European revenues through headquarters in low-tax countries like Ireland and Luxembourg. The French plan would take 3% of digital sales in France from companies that have global revenues of over 750 million euros and French revenue of more than 25 million euros. It would affect around 30 companies and could raise 500 million euros a year. Other European countries have launched their own digital tax efforts after an EU-wide measure failed to win support earlier this year.
Florian Berco, a good bill?
A good bill.
Is it a good law?
Yes, it's not exactly a GAFA law, but it's a way to maybe make the tech company contribute to the social goods. So it's a good intuition. We maybe discuss the modality and how it's working. But when we see, in a microeconomic point of view, because I'm rating startups, if we see the startup ecosystem, they are raising 4 billion euros in France each year. On these 4 billion euros, we see that half is coming from the public funds through subsidiaries, through tax reductions. So that's why it can be good that when you succeed, you can contribute at the end to finance all the digital infrastructure and also the knowledge. So future tech people that will work in the startups.
Yeah, because it's only been 20 years, right, since we've had Google, and 10 years since we've had, a little more since we've had Facebook, and yet there's this concentration of the wealth in the hands of a few.
Yeah, and we can remember Donald Trump, the president of the United States, saying in March 2000 last year, saying that maybe the founder and Amazon was not paying enough tax. So we see that it's a debate, and it's not only a French debate, but it's more a global debate. And I'm incubating at the Paris Dauphine University. So we received last month Christine Lagarde, and she raised a question saying that in a global economy, we can't tax with a national base because the digital economy is without frontiers.
The imbalance is pretty clear. French business magazine Challenge compared the number of members for Facebook across the continent with revenue earned. And that's a pretty, the graphic speaks for itself. No points for guessing where Mark Zuckerberg pays his taxes in Europe. And if you doubt those revenues, you get what Google earns, which is basically double that of Facebook. The French bill is based on one that failed, by the way, on the European level. 4 nations opposed: Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and, well, look at the graph, Ireland. Julien Pelfig, what's not to like about this French bill?
So the purpose for the new bill was to restore some kind of tax equity, right? It's what you just mentioned. Supposedly the large tech companies are not paying enough tax, and so this bill was supposed to change that situation. The problem is that when you're looking at the incidence of the tax, who will pay the tax in the end, it's very likely that the tax will be passed on to either the final consumer through an increase in the product prices, or the small company, the merchants that are using the platform to sell their products. So in the end, it's very likely that a significant portion of the tax, around 90%, will be either an increase in the product price, so like a consumption tax, or a reduction in the profitability of the small business, so like an increase corporate income tax on small companies. So
what's a fairer way then?
So this is the problem. So it's not only the large digital company. The international tax infrastructure has been built in the 1930s when the economy was obviously very different from what it is today. And it's now the current system is strained and it doesn't work anymore. So the international community needs to reach a consensus on a new way to divide the tax pie, basically. And the problem is that so far they haven't been able to reach a consensus. So some country gets fed up they get tired of waiting, and they start implementing unilateral measures like France did, or India before them. The problem is, it's mostly a strategic decision. So what is the best way to reach a consensus? The only solution will come from a consensus. So the consensus can be reached either through negotiation within the OECD or through threats, like by imposing unilateral measure. The problem is by imposing unilateral measure, you can also reach a point where other countries are imposing other unilateral measure as a retaliation, like the US did, which may end up in a global tax war instead of a consensus. So I think this is the issue.
And Nordelat, do you agree that France may have jumped the gun here?
Actually, I don't think it's realistic to think that there can be a consensus. There is a conflict of interest. Like everyone, every country would be better off to reduce their tax to attract this very mobile capital. And that's exactly what we have seen over the last 30 years, I'd say. So the corporate tax has progressively decreased under the competition, the tax competition, the worldwide tax competition. So, I mean, it's very important that we have attempt of international cooperation through the OECD, for example, so through international organization, intergovernmental negotiations, but I see it totally unrealistic to reach a consensus. Think of Ireland or think of Netherlands. They would be really worse off.
So how do you handle
impose,
Ireland and the Netherlands in that case? What do you do?
So the one of the solution is, as France is doing, taking the lead, trying to impose a tax. France cannot do it by herself. So we need Germany, Italy, and Spain. We need 4 countries in Europe to impose a system. Then the hope is that the rest of the countries are going to follow. But the thinking that we can find a consensus, the only thing that we're going to reach is the smallest denominator. So you need big power, big countries, big economies to impose a new system. And in fact, this system is totally outdated. So we need to tax sales because sales are not mobile while capital is mobile. There are lots of multinational corporate. They have this possibility to pretend, to transfer their profits and to pretend that their profit has been made in Bermuda or in Luxembourg or in Ireland. So we need to tax sales because sales are not mobile. Not only sales on advertising, like this law is planning, but sales. Like how many iPods were iPhone or iPod were sold in France
I'm just curious because Julien
Germany.
Pelfig is shaking his head. You don't agree with that? Sales is easy to tax?
So I agree with a lot of things that has been said. I disagree with 2 points. So on the consensus, I think we have to find a consensus one way or another, because let's put it that way. The question of international tax is the profit of the corporate profit is $11,000 billion per year, and the
11 trillion.
11 trillion, yeah. And the question is, how do you? So it's a big pie, and the question is, how do you divide the pie between the country? How do you determine the share of each pie? And so, of course, it's a game where every country will want to impose a rule that gives him the bigger pie. But if you don't reach a consensus on how to divide the pie, the question is that the thing that will came out is that everybody will decide the size of the pie unilaterally, and then in the end, companies will be taxed multiple times. So if there is a company has a profit of 100 between 2 countries, and I say I want to tax 80, and you say you want to tax 80, then the company will be taxed on 160. So this is the problem. And just quickly on the sales. So it's true that sales is the less mobile base. So you can say it's a good way to allocate the profit. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily the most equitable from a worldwide standpoint. If you are looking at Africa and a lot of developing countries, you don't have a large consumption base there. So if you allocate the corporate profit based on sales, you will allocate a large part of the profit to the old rich countries.
And Lord de Latte?
Cooperation on double taxation system is something that you can actually address after. Let me just give you the revenues of Ireland, which is taxing officially corporate by 12.5%, but in fact, we all know that Apple or Google are actually paying 0.5% of their corporate profits. But it's still a lot. It's still a lot of revenues for Ireland. So they don't have any interest in finding a consensus. That's totally unrealistic. Now, the double system of taxation, I don't see the point because the sales of the iPhone in France are not made twice. So taxation is a very technical issue, and it's also a matter of public economics. So it's super sensitive. I understand that. But there are simple solutions that we can impose. And I strongly believe that the cooperation of 4 big countries which have aligned interests. We don't have aligned interest with Netherlands and Ireland, but we have aligned interest with Germany, Italy, and Spain. We can impose a system.
All right, let me just remind our viewers here. The United States has been arguing for the tax home of all corporations to come under scrutiny and not to single out e-commerce. We can show you that under this bill that's been approved by the Senate, it would be any tech company with digital revenues of more than 750 million euros. At least 25 million has to be generated in France. They'll be subject to the tax. Around 30 companies, most of them are from the US, but they're also Chinese, German, British, will be paying up. One French digital advertising platform, Criteo. And Quentin Parinello, you heard Anne-Laure Delat give the example of Apple. Actually, the iPhone itself wouldn't fall under this bill because the iPhone is not e-commerce. That's an actual physical...
On the digital sales tax, on the digital service tax, it would not fall under that. But on wider rules that are currently being discussed at the OECD level, it may fall under those new rules. On the so-called Gafa tax, just to take a step back and understand how it was conceived, because I think it's important to understand the politics behind it. It was first originally discussed at EU level as a sort of package with a long-term solution that is reforming the way our corporate income tax works with international rules, and sort of a short-term solution to make sure that the companies that benefit the most from the current loopholes do pay at least some taxes. So the question in France right now is whether or not this actually make large digital companies pay at least some taxes. The answer would be rather not, because the revenues yielded are quite small. But however, and this is where the consensus that we were discussing before is quite important, this unilateral move by France pushed the US back to the negotiation table, because they were not willing 2 years ago, they were not willing 1 year ago to actually, commit to discuss at the international stage. And right now they are. And right now we have 130 countries that are ready to discuss. And I agree 100% that this will be a tough discussion, but this is the opportunity right now to have a deep reform of the way our international corporate tax system works.
And there's also that threat of retaliatory tariffs, which I'll ask you about, Quentin. When we come back, stay with us here watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at France approving a bill that taxes digital giants over 3% on their revenues earned in this country. France going it alone for a lack of consensus on the global stage, and the U.S. now talking about retaliation. We're talking about it with Florian Bercot, co-founder of the startups rating agency Estimeo, economist Julien Pelfig, partner at consultants Deloitte Tage. We're also in the company of assistant professor of Quentin Parinello, senior, you're the assistant professor at Paris Dauphine University.
Paris 2.
At Paris 2, Paris 2 University. Quentin Parinello, senior policy officer on tax justice at the charity Oxfam here in France, that they're a branch here. And from the Normandy city of Caen, Anne-Laure Delat of the International Economics Research Group, CEPI. Donald Trump taking aim with launching the process for retaliatory sanctions or tariffs, if you will, against France. But we should say it's not just Trump. The doors in Washington have long been wide open to the Silicon Valley. Here you see a much younger Barack Obama hosting Google's Eric Schmidt at the White House in different times. And Quentin Parinello, there's support on both sides of the aisle in Washington for hitting France with retaliatory tariffs.
What's really interesting about the statement, though, is that they said they're still committed to work at the international stage, which was also one of the purpose of the unilateral move, push the US back at the international stage. And now both the US and France are incentivized, so to speak, to actually find a consensus and find it quickly. Because right now, the US large digital companies are going to be taxed in France. And France is under pressure from the US with tariff retaliations. So they need to find a consensus quickly.
How much pain can the US inflict on France?
I think it's not the question right now. The question is whether or not
It's not the question?
It's whether or not we can find a consensus quickly to have an overhaul reform of international corporate tax rules, because this will solve everything. And right now we have all the actors on the table, and this is what was necessary from the very beginning.
All right, it's not just France. There's Spain, Austria, and the UK, which is introducing its own Gafa tax, not 3%, but 2% starting next spring, although some don't call them Gafas.
It's deeply unfair. It's deeply unfair that high street businesses are paying tax through the nose in business rates and corporation and everything else, whereas the internet giants, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, are paying virtually nothing.
Florent Berco, you like that term, fangs?
Not really. More diplomatic, I would say. No, it's a big debate, but if we can take back forward, it's a question of valuation of company and intangible assets. That is the question. Is not a question only on taxation, but on the accountability, how we measure the value creation of companies. So we see, for example, Uber company that is valuated $100 billion of dollars without making any revenue. So it's complicated, the equation, when you have a political role and need to finance a society. So the question is how we can try to measure the impact of intangible assets, how we measure the value created by the startups and all these digital companies.
And the French don't have it quite right yet?
No, not directly.
What is the right recipe?
The recipe is maybe to share data first of all, and the states have the power of capturing and trying to share the data to try to build a key measure of the value creation. But it's an issue even for us to have startups well valuated and powerful also.
And you saw. With the case of the UK and Nord-de-Latte, their Gafa tax, their digital tax, 2%, the one that's been passed by the French Senate this Thursday, 3%, already there's a discrepancy.
Yeah, all right. So there is also a tax competition, even at this stage. Let me get back to the technical issue, the difficulty of valuing, assessing the value of a company. Again, this is a very hot topic currently, and we owe the people a simple debate. So that might look very technical, but in the end, some companies are very simply not paying taxes. And if you want to put it very simply, at CEPI, we've put together the international data, the data on international investment stocks. One every $2 goes through a tax haven, okay, of portfolio assets like securities, government bonds, corporate bonds. One every $2 go through a tax haven. Almost the same for FDI. FDI, foreign direct investment, that means affiliate. Okay, it's very simple to understand. Almost one every $2 that is used to open an affiliate is used in a tax haven.
And how do you shut it down?
More than half of it. Sorry?
How do you shut it down? How do you stop that?
Sorry, I didn't. So no, it's just, let me just finish the point. Half of this we cannot understand. There is no reason except tax evasion for that. So now, how do you stop it? How do you stop it? There was some hope on transparency, and I'm a big advocate of transparency, because the more data we have, the better we understand, and the more civil society can actually pressure companies. Because, you know, Facebook did not comment today, because Facebook, the users of Facebook are also taxpayers. So, I mean, more data, more transparency can actually be effective on putting pressures on these multinationals. And as Quentin was saying, on putting the people at the same table to try and negotiate. But there are some limits in the transparency. And some recent findings show that when one tax haven become more transparent, then you have large movements of capital towards less transparent tax havens. So everything is not going to get resolved with transparency. So you need you need very strong political will, probably driven by the civil society, to impose a new system. And this civil society, I mean, it's a tough moment for public finance, for public funds currently, public finance.
Let's talk about that pressure from civil society, from ordinary citizens. Quentin Parinello, what foreign journalists covering the Yellow Vest movement, one of the things that surprised them was people from working class backgrounds able to argue the point about complicated issues when it comes to taxes. It's something that really rails people, and as a result, you could argue that it's in part thanks to the Yellow Vest movement that we're talking about this today.
Absolutely. The Yellow Vest movement put back the notion of tax justice back in the political debate, and at least at the higher stage that it was before, and it sort of moved the agenda up. So that's a good thing. Now, the question of whether multinationals pay their fair share, as we've seen recent scandals and a number of tax scandals that have been bubbling up just over the past 4 years, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, LuxLeaks, and so on, we've seen that companies are using loopholes on the international tax rules to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And the charts that we were showing before are very interesting. They're basically showing that companies are deciding where they register their revenues and basically where they pay their taxes. And usually they register their revenues not where they have their real economic activities. What's being discussed right now at the OECD is a way to actually reconcile that and make sure that multinational companies do pay their taxes where they have their real economic activities. And the debate that we had before in the first part was, what is real economic activities? Is it just sales? Is it production? Is it the assets? Is it users? All of these questions need to be addressed at the OECD.
Are you more hopeful after the recent G20 summit? The G20 represents 85% of the economic activity on the planet, those 20 nations. Are you more hopeful they talked about it as they've been talking about it at the OECD, about making these global rules when it comes to where you pay your taxes?
The program of action, what is on the table, is interesting. But again, getting a consensus around 130 countries, which are the number of countries that are at the table right now, is very difficult. And we've been discussing on the first pillar of work, which is basically who gets to tax what, which country gets to tax what. But there's a second pillar that is, it's called the minimum effective tax rates. And it's supposed to basically avoid companies using tax haven to, pay less taxes. And that second pillar is very important because if we do it right, it could remove the incentive from companies to fuel the race to the bottom, and all countries could actually yield extra revenues.
Is it mission impossible, Julien Pelfig, to prevent that race to the bottom?
No, it's true that it's a question of coordination. So currently we're in a state of a competition where each country is trying to attract capital and also taxable basis. So countries like Ireland, who have a corporate income tax rate that is very low, they generate much more corporate income tax than France, twice as much compared to their GDP as France, who has a tax rate of 35%. So if you're just looking at some countries, it's a good political decision. I mean, it's great for. So can we reach a consensus? It's a difficult. The thing is,
you're shaking your head. No.
It's. So the problem is that tax is at the core of sovereignty, right? The power to tax almost determines the frontier of a jurisdiction, right? But here, the economy is becoming completely global. So the only solution can only be reached through negotiation and consensus. So this is the problem. No country wants to.
But you heard Anne Lortelat say, at some point, the big countries, if the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Italians,
Yeah,
the
but I
the
don't
big
say-
players
yeah.
inside the EU say this is where we're going, the Irish are going to have to follow.
No, so I don't believe that, because if the large rich country who have a large consumer base say we all agree corporate income tax should be allocated based on consumption, of course, I mean it's a self-serving solution, but African countries, Southeastern Asian countries won't agree to that. And what they were going to do, they are going to say, no, we disagree with those rules. We are going to put in place our own rules, and you will have a double taxation.
Florian Berco?
Yeah, maybe what we can say is that it's a global issue. That's why we can't say and work just on taxation. If we make a parallel to climate change, it's also a global problem, and we need to have many solutions to solve it. So I come back to my intangible asset and valuation. If I can maybe give an example to illustrate my what I want to say is in 2005 when Skype was acquired by eBay, it was acquired for more than $2 billion of valuation. But in the account, you see $200 million of dollars valuation. So you see $2 billion of differentiation on the valuation. So we need to create standards, and it's maybe can begin with accountability issues, and after taxation. It's maybe we need to try to solve the limit of maybe finance.
Well, we're in an era of new transparency. We're seeing much more
Yes.
cross-border cooperation between different revenue services.
Yes.
And
even more data. So we have a transparency directive in the European.
but it's also an issue, as Julien was saying, of sovereignty.
Yes, it's a question of sovereignty. But for example, on financial data, it will be open in 2020 with XBRL technique. So all the financial data will be available for analysts. So we need also maybe to have more analysts on tech company and in all Europe to maybe describe the movement, try to compete on the valuation aspect.
When we talk about sovereignty, what's interesting is that usually we talk about sovereignty as my country has the right to lower its tax rate. But the fact of lowering your tax rate has an impact on another country because it attracts investment that would have been elsewhere if not. So when we talk about protecting your tax base, it's also the fact that if I prevent other countries to cut their tax rates, I'm also protecting, it's also my sovereign interest. So this is also sort of mindset that is being discussed right now at the OECD with the minimum effective tax rate. If you want to impose corporate profits at 0%, I have the right to tax the difference. And this is what's also revolutionary, philosophically speaking, right now.
And Nordula, what does your crystal ball tell you when it comes to those negotiations taking place at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development?
So I like your expression, François. I don't have any crystal ball. To me, what we have all just described is very comparable to the negotiations for climate change, as was said before. We're actually facing big public international issues currently. And what we all need to understand is that there are vested interests on the one hand, so the big polluters for climate change, the low taxpayers companies for the tax evasion issue, and civil society on the other hand. And so what is quite new, I guess, compared to 100 years ago when this tax system was implemented and when our new world was actually implemented, is that civil society and democracy is much more developed. It looked like maybe naive because we're facing big issues with our democracy, but we have Oxfam, for example, all these NGOs which are actually playing a key role in this debate. So crystal ball, I don't have any. The only thing I strongly believe in is that the voters, the electorate have to push their government, to put pressure on their government because it's a collective interest that these companies pay more taxes, that Starbucks, to not name anyone, pay more tax, or at least, the same amount of tax as the cafe brasserie around the corner.
Yeah, it's the second time in our conversation that we've talked. It's interesting about how you tackle problems with global warming, and fiscal justice was a recurring theme. We were saying it earlier during the Yellow Vest movements. Remember, it was a now-shelved diesel tax that sparked the anger of working-class commuters. And it quickly grew to include a general defiance over a tax system that they felt punished the little guy. This week, France's government responding on 2 counts their demands. First, with the Gafa tax we're going through and we're talking about here, but also the unveiling of an eco-tax on flying.
The eco-contribution will be of €1.50 in economy class inside the EU. €9 for business travel within the EU, €3 outside the EU in economy class, and €18 outside the EU in business class.
Yeah, so this eco-tax on flying, Air France responded that it's going to punish the passengers and it's going to punish the airlines.
So we've seen that there's a recurrent rhetoric around the fact that it's going to be passed on to the customers. What's interesting is that the Yellow Vest movement started on the basis that carbon pricing and carbon tax in France were unfair. In fact, when you're on the poorest part of the people, you pay proportionately more taxes on carbon when you're part of the richest. And this is because of a lot of loopholes, including loopholes on taxation. What's interesting is that they're taking taxation, which is planes are most used by the richest people. So the sort of goal is to put the tax burden on the richest people, but the amount of the tax that has been announced right now is very small compared to other countries, because this tax already exists in 6 other EU countries, and France has the lowest prices, the lowest tax levels.
On this eco-tax?
On this eco-tax, yes.
Right. Do you find, Julien Pelfig, let me ask you a personal question, that over the past year, you've sort of rethought the way we're taxed, and you're thinking about, because having in the same week both of these new taxes introduced by the government here?
It's not completely new, and it's. I think we shouldn't mix together those 2 taxes. So the eco tax is a classical Pigovian tax, as we call it in economics. So it means that the purpose of the tax is to be passed on to increase the price of the airplane tickets, so that less people consume airplane tickets and less people fly. And so we have less carbon in the atmosphere. So it's the same as the carbon tax, and so this is so it's not a question of justice, or it's not a question of this tax is not supposed to bring money to the state. It's supposed to change the behavior of the people.
But it's the idea as well. We heard in that little clip from the transport minister of how do you do it fairly so it won't be the same tax if you're in economy class or in business class.
Exactly, but this is where it gets messy, because it's too complicated, but it's not the way it should be done. But then if we are looking at the so-called Gafa tax, which is actually not Gafa but digital service tax, it's not at all the same. And the purpose of the digital service tax is not to increase the price of the digital goods so that less people consume digital goods, right? The purpose of that tax is just to correct an unfairness in the way the corporate tax is distributed. So it's completely different. And the fact that the Gafa tax, call it that way, is not a tax on profit, but it's a tax on the revenue, and so it will be passed on to the consumer, change completely the outcome of the bill, because it's not going to restore any equity. It's going to impact the poorest households. So I don't know if I make myself clear.
No, you have indeed, and we can't help, even yourself, you can't help yourself calling it a Gafa tax. People watching this show in the United States, they think it's Yankee bashing, no, to a certain degree. They think it's how these Europeans are going after the Americans because they're jealous. They're not as good at us as at e-commerce.
So there were definitely something like that in previous version of the Google tax. So there was a previous version of the Google tax proposed by Senator Marini, I think a couple of years ago, where it was explicitly designed so that the European ecosystem of tech company would grow up. But I don't think it's the case with the current DST.
And we will see if the Gafa company will still work with French data scientists and French tech guys, because we see a lot of Gafa coming in France for the last years, implementing their labs to work on data and
they'll still be coming.
Recruiting.
They'll still be coming.
French skills. So maybe.
I think we shouldn't see it as targeting Americans. We should see that tax as targeting the companies that benefit the most from the current loopholes in the tax system, and they happen to be Americans. So that's the sort of nuance I would put there.
And
if I may just step in, the tech companies are not the only one evading tax, and the other big sector is pharma and drug makers. Recently, some figures have been published, and big pharma companies are actually using loopholes also to evade tax. So I don't know if it's something about American or if it's something about tech companies. What the economics and the data tell us is that it's a matter of multinational companies which are not playing with the same rules as small companies. So this kind of tax should actually be broadened to the whole M&E, multinational enterprises.
And on that, you agree with the United States. Julien Pelfig?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with most of it. There's just one distinction that I would like to make. So Anne-Laure mentioned before that it's a political issue, and civil society should, through the vote, impose new leaders that would change the tax infrastructure. I think this is really a political problem between states. It has nothing to do with companies. So multinational companies are reacting to incentives that the states are giving. So when a state is saying, come to me, I will give you a sweet deal.
Let's not be naive. These same companies, they give political contributions to campaigns.
I mean, I don't know if you can make that. I don't know if this is so obvious. What I mean to say is that I think it's a bit unfair to point at companies and say, it's not paying any taxes, because most of the time they are doing things that are perfectly legal under the certain countries' law. So I mean, if you want to change things, and I also completely understand that the current state of affairs and the diagram that you showed at the beginning of the show are shocking. But it's really a question for the states to decide of a new framework.
Final word on this?
Yeah. So indeed, the final effort should be on the state. But the difficulty is that if one state goes alone on this, companies may actually leave the country and go to another one. So this is why we need to have a consensus at the global level, even though that's going to be difficult, and we need to have a consensus on a solution that takes into account the interests of developing countries and developed countries as well.
Quentin Parinello, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Florian Berco, Julien Pelfig, I want to thank as well Anne-Laure Delat for being with us from Caen in Normandy. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.